Okay, we have had a chance to talk about this in class, but I'm going to post this here anyway, and hope that I can just create a bit of clarity. So the second assessment task, it is, if you're struggling with it, it's probably because you're trying to make it slightly more complicated than I'm asking for. And I don't mean that as a dig. I know that typically you don't do this kind of work. Really what I'm wanting you to do is to describe something that makes sense to a normal human being, not a university thing. So obviously the second assessment task has three components and then a group component. So for the moment, let's just talk about the three components. Each of these components is independent of the other components. They don't have to link together. Think of them as a little web article, just 500 words that sits on its own. You're answering a single question for each of these components and they're independent of the others. I am asking you to use journal articles and referencing wherever you're referring to evidence outside of your own brain. So for instance, if you're saying the presence of exercise equipment has important implications for physical health, then I want to hear that you've actually used a reference, not that you personally just believe that, right? So you will be using references. You'll also be doing research about the nature of the community. So don't tell me that that because Albury is a small town that they don't have any exercise equipment when you haven't actually had a look and realized, hold on a minute, Albury actually has a whole bunch of gyms in town, okay? So you need to draw on evidence about the community that you've found online, evidence from academic literature to say that one thing relates to another thing, and then your job is to string it together as a single 500-word story. Now, the first component of this is the First Nations component. So really what I'm getting you to do is to think about, how did First Nations communities thrive? How and why did they thrive in this area? Now, obviously, if you're in Albury, the river might have had something important there. So go and investigate. What were First Nations beliefs about the river? What were the cultural sites? How did they do life in this space in a way that enabled them to thrive? Maybe it was the fact that they only harvested in certain places at certain times of the year. Maybe it was the fact that they moved around to different locations depending on the weather. But what were the things that enabled them to do really, really well and survive for so long when other cultures right across the world were not? Okay, this is not about being complicated. It's about going, you know what? There were some key cultural sites around the area, and people from communities right across the region would come together for a celebration of something, and that actually increased the sense of social connectedness, okay? Again, you're going to reference where that information came from, but it's about crafting an argument. So what is it about this place? The river in Albury, it might be, the fact that there's a dirty, great big pile of rocks that looks like a pyramid in Pyramid Hill. Like, there's all sorts of different things that are in each community. What was it about this place that enabled them to thrive? Presence of food, presence of water, presence of special locations, cultural practices, cultural beliefs, any of those things. But tell me, how did that enable them to thrive? So that's 500 words, done. Once that's done, you can lock it up, put it in and just kind of move on to the next bit. Doesn't have to be connected to the next bit and shouldn't be. The next bit, describe how 3 or more community characteristics might influence the health and well-being of the communities for outcomes for the community. This really is kind of the same as the first question, but asking now. So what is it about the nature of the community that enables communities to thrive? Now, I've had a chat to a couple of students who are looking at these complex kind of things. To be honest, I'd be perfectly happy if you talked about how the presence of sporting clubs means that young people feel more connected to one another. And the evidence says that if you feel more connected, that your mental health outcomes are better, okay? Really pragmatic stuff. So when I'm talking about characteristics, I'm talking about anything you would use to describe Albury. When someone says to me, oh, tell me something about Albury, the first thing I think of is the presence of lots of really good food, okay? Now, if you're working in Heathcote, the characteristics of Heathcote, the first thing that I think of is, there's only 2 primary schools and no high school, okay? So great for primary school kids, but what about the high school kids? They've got a hospital. All of these things are characteristics, but so is the hill next door. The fact that you can go mountain biking in the park, the open spaces, all of these things are characteristics. So what you want to do is make a connection between the characteristics, anything that you would use to describe, the fact that there's lots of wine in Heathcote, anything that you would use to describe Heathcote, how might that influence health and well-being? Now start with the positive. You can move to the negative, but start with the positive, okay? So describe a couple of ways in which those, how 3 or more community characteristics, so you might go, presence of education, the presence of wine, and the presence of something else, how they influence health and well-being. Again, 500 words, done. Okay, it's separate from the other sections. The final individual section is the area of your health profession. Now, this is going to be different for all of you, but think about your health discipline. If you're a podiatrist, your health area is feet. Now, obviously, podiatrists are not the only ones who have an influence on feet. The presence of walking paths also has an influence on feet. Same with dentistry. It's not just dentists that have an influence on oral health. The presence of lolly shops, the availability of dentists is obviously part of it, but also just basic knowledge about oral health, or basic cultural assumptions about whether it's okay to have grubby teeth or not. So think about what are the characteristics that might influence health in your discipline area. Now, for some of you, social work and nursing in particular, it's really broad. You know, nurses, you think about all the different things that you do, that means you can talk about any of those things. I was just chatting to someone before about the important role that nurses play in educating people about health. So obviously, being lower educational status in a particular area may well have an influence on people's health literacy, which is an important role for nurses, okay? So you've got to make an argument as to why these characteristics are influencing health in this particular area. Now, the final section, it does build on your knowledge of that you've developed in the first 3 sections. But again, it's quite distinct. It's not the same thing. So what you're doing in this final section is you're really looking at the community broadly and going, okay, what's it good at? Because this is always where we should start. So it might be absolutely brilliant at jobs, okay? So it might be a really, really prosperous area, might be great at jobs, might be really good at sporting clubs, and it might have a great health service. So you might decide they're the things you want to talk about, okay? These are the strengths. Being really good at jobs means that people have greater availability of finance and housing, and they can eat well and do all of these things. So describe those. What are those key strengths? But then what you need to do is you need to work out what is the next thing that this community needs to work on. So imagine that your group have been pulled in as consultants, and the council have come to you and said, look, the sporting club are telling us that they want more sporting facilities. The hospital tell us that they want more beds. The schools tell us that they want more buildings. But we're really struggling to work out what the next most important thing is. We know that all of these things are important, but we want to know what we should do next. Okay, so your group's job is to make an argument for what they should do next and why that should be the next thing. Okay, another conversation I was having today was about housing, and we're talking about, okay, what's more important, the mental health of people who are experiencing homelessness or whether they've got housing? Well, mental health of people experiencing homelessness is super important, no question, but there's no point really trying to deal with that before you've actually given them a roof over their head. So the priority would actually be the roof. And what we're trying to do with this is to get you really thinking and making an argument for what is the next most important thing for this community to work on, okay? Now the final section, make sure that you do that as a group. It is designed to be done fairly easily if you're in a group having a conversation about what are the strengths and what are the next thing, okay? Don't cut it up and write 200 words each. Work out what you're going to say and then work out a way of kind of getting everybody to make their contribution. I hope this helps. I will go against my original plan and I will provide 10 minutes to ask questions next week. So please make sure that you've actually done everything about this assessment task that you possibly can, because then you will ask better questions, okay? Generally, when students are struggling with this task, it's because they haven't started, and I understand that, but you've got enough information to start. So I want you to give it a red hot go. What do you know about the characteristics of the community for First Nations and now, and what do you think that might influence in terms of well-being for First Nations community and well-being for people now generally, and well-being for in the discipline area that you're focused on, okay? Map that stuff out, start to write it down, and then work out what you don't know. Now remember that you need to use references to make your argument. You need to actually understand the nature and the characteristics of the community. Just web search is fine in order to be able to do this. I don't really care what citation method you use, but we need to be able to see where the information came from. Okay, so if you use an URL for a website, that's fine, but just make sure you include enough for us to follow it up. I hope this has been helpful. Feel free to reach out for questions during class time or otherwise if you're really desperate. Otherwise, get stuck into it. This is the super practical stuff. How does the nature of the community enable us to thrive? Really important question, probably not as complicated as you might be thinking. Thanks.